with Jane Curtis today, and we're going to find out about this cold weather thing. I know cold weather affects me, so let's see how it affects history. Jane, you've got some little secrets for us.
Here we are in Christmas week, and remember that usually comes when it's cold.
That's right.
But sometimes when it's warm, so we can't even be sure of that.
That's right.
We do have some things. There are an awful lot of interesting things in history, but some are very local, the things where the cold weather or the bad weather has affected it. Right. Some are so local that we really won't go into most of them, but I have, 4 or 5 things here that I think will be very interesting for us, and we're squeezing them in under the line of history too.
Okay.
History. If we look at the first picture, please, we will say to ourselves, now who is this handsome man? I hope we will see.
Do we have the picture?
Who is our handsome man? There he is. Yeah, who is that? Well, that is Peter the Great of Russia. Now, how in the world does he get into a show about how wintry weather affects world history? Well, he gets in there because he was the one who was trying to open the window to the west. Russia was really no kind of a power on the world stage or anything then. But they've been trying under Empress Catherine, in the 1700s, and hadn't gotten too far. But when he came along, he decided this is going to be it. He went and had himself trained as a carpenter in Holland and everything. And then when he got home, he started rearranging Russia. He decided he'd invade Sweden, and they'd get a little more territory out there. So they had some engagements, and he wasn't doing all that well. But then a terrible winter set in. This was the year 1709.
Okay.
And it's astounding how other things that happened around that time never mention things like this weather that affect outcomes very much. Well, it was in effect all over Western Europe, but Sweden got quite a dose of it, and they had a lot of deaths from the cold and a lot of death from famine caused by the cold. And their army, of course, had suffered apace. So here our friend, our handsome friend, was able to beat them fairly handily. And this was the first time that Russia, as a country, as an entity, had appeared really on the world stage in some kind of a role. Because after that, they played a role, and they've played a role in world history since. And this is just a small little item to bring us in, but you see how something apparently...
So the Russians were more prepared for the cold weather than the Swedes?
Well, possibly, but the Russians, of course, just had so many people back there, back in the hinterland. They didn't have any problem with that, and they were used to not being rich. In fact, I guess even the Tsar was not living like a prince exactly. But that's just a small example. Well, you never know what affects what like that. And in a way, I guess it's helpful in world history. If you see certain things happening, you can try to figure out what course you should take to avoid them or to bring them on or whatever. But see, I'm justifying this topic because I think it's so interesting. But a larger topic for that, this was 1709, as I say. And later in the 1700s, of course, our country was being settled at that point, being governed. In 1777, George Washington, this is in the early years of the Revolutionary War, George Washington and an army of about 12,000, Continental Army, were active there in Pennsylvania, and around just that area in general. And they, all summer long, they'd been fighting and having mostly little engagements, and they hadn't been doing terribly well. And came September, and the British moved right on in and took Philadelphia. And this was important, and of course the Continental Army couldn't do much about it. So September melted into October, and everybody was thinking about winter quarters. Armies in those days usually just closed shop for the winter. But so he decided they were in the vicinity of now famous name Valley Forge. and he decided on winter quarters at Valley Forge. There was a small house there which became the headquarters, but otherwise the men set to building some little log structures. And they were not in terribly good shape because they hadn't exactly been oversupplied with food and things during. They were tired, some of them were sick, with little injuries. But they set up camp there, and this was actually a very canny choice for a place because it was about 20 miles away from Philadelphia. So he could keep his hand on General Howe down there, the British. There was a Schuylkill River. Of course, it was high. They were higher than Philadelphia, so attacking them would have been harder. The Schuylkill River provided transport. They were in the middle of an agricultural area where there would be some food if there was any anywhere. Let's see, there was another good reason why they put him there. Well, they had plenty of drill ground at that point. And they dug in. And it wasn't very long before the first of 3 or 4 bitter, cruel cold snaps came up. And I don't just mean freezing or touch frost overnight. These were in the single digits number, like minus or plus 5, and hover around 0 down there. So as time wore on, things got worse and worse, and their food supply dried up. They had allies there in the form of a local Indian nation, the Oneidas. The Oneidas helped them. The women helped them figure out how to eat, how to prepare such food as they had, how to do some cooking things, and how to mend their clothes and maybe mend their shoes, you know, so they'd last a little longer. So they got some real help from those people. But as the worst of the cold would come on, last a few days, and then be a little better, but then everything would thaw, so it would turn muddy. And that plague, you know, the World War I, the Civil, everything, mud is just the soldiers' enemy. So that came on. Some of the soldiers, their wives and even children would come, be with them, because the wives had no means of subsisting at home either. So they'd come, and they did some of the mending and things like that, and helping the cooking and all that, and probably a morale factor. And the husbands might have felt, well, you know, they're my folks. I've got to be brave and all that. Let's look at a few pictures. Well, things were going bad. Now here's Washington on foot, and you see he's saluting, and you see a soldier over there saluting back. These soldiers look kind of sad. We go on to the next picture. We'll see him again. Sorry, I couldn't. Some of these I couldn't make bigger, but here's one where he's on horseback. Oh, I think we maybe skipped a picture because that, I believe, is the Marquis de Lafayette. Help came in the form from the French and from the Germans, and there were even a couple of Polish generals or colonels there. But the main ones were the German one, von Steuben and Lafayette, and they drilled these soldiers as well. So when this terrible winter came, they at least weren't just lying there on the ground. They were trying, you know, they were plodding through the mud, they were doing something. They were building their morale. Now, a lot of them did not survive. Some of the soldiers got sick and died. And there was a certain amount of disease, but it didn't just run rampant, luckily. But it was still a very, very difficult time, even with these helpful things going on. Let us look at another picture, please. See the next. Oh, that's the one that I think is Lafayette. And you can see in the background there was a little campfire. This is one of the huts, one of the little things that they built, and you can see there wouldn't be much. If the temperature is 5 degrees above 0 outside, that's not going to be doing you any good at all. The inside, now the next picture should show the inside of one of these. Now this is a modern one, a modern made one, but back there, the next picture we see is a real one for some ruin they found, and those aren't even logs, and especially in the bunk bed there, they're just twigs. So here are these people out here really suffering, not even having any place to go in to get warm at night. This is a picture, a drawing, obviously, but an early one, of a woman, and this is Oneida Woman, Indian woman, only went by the name of Polly Cooper. I found no other name for her, but she was a leading figure in that. And if you can discern in this, you see two soldiers sitting there looking kind of sad. The one in the distance there, one of his shoes is totally gone. He's barefoot, and the other one needs help, and gives you some of an idea when they were parked up there at Valley Forge, holding the ground, trying to exist into the spring. And, another picture will show us again from Valley Forge. The next one in line will be the, I guess, yeah, could we see the next picture in line, please? Yeah, here's one where you have the drilling. They're trying to start to drill the soldiers. You see they're more or less in line, and that represents General von Steuben. I guess he probably taught them how to, they didn't have swords, but how to wield whatever they had. Next picture. Oh, well, let's pause a minute then. I just leave that one there, because we're going to wind up with Valley Forge and the difficulties, the noble time they had, and how well they succeeded. Mm-hmm. And eventually, when spring came, the British were forced out of Philadelphia because France declared war finally, and they didn't want to have any part of the French Navy, and the France was sending ships, who later at Yorktown, in fact, remember, swayed the battle in our favor.
Right.
But by the end of it, they were still hungry, and some of them sick, and so on, but they were well drilled, they were confident. 4,000 of them had disappeared out of the 12,000. They had died, or they had deserted
to go home.
Or they signed on for a certain term, and some of them had said, well, my term is up, goodbye.
Right.
So the Washington still had about 8,000 troops who were much better prepared. They were better drilled, they were more confident. They had had some food again, and on they went. So here's a classic example of how winter got in there and just made things. They could have moved around or left or done something they wanted if it weren't for these terrible conditions. But it's a good thing they didn't, because they were in a good spot.
Right.
And they kept the British from even thinking about trying to escape in that direction.
Right.
So now the next thing on our list, I want us to suddenly find ourselves in Austria in 1818. And this is not a wartime situation. It's a situation in a little town near Salzburg up in the hills. And on the left, you have a local clergyman who was already also the school teacher. And on the right, a young man who wrote poetry and did things. And standing up there, that thing in the middle, is a piece of music. And that piece of music is Silent Night. Mm-hmm. And why do I bring that in to something that winter has caused?
Because that's why it was
worldwide
written.
Something. Well, because Christmas Eve, that very night, they got together, and there was they were the only ones there, and I guess the rest of the neighborhood couldn't make it in. That's the congregation. But all they had, the organ was out of whack. The river had flooded. Organ wasn't working, they discovered, but he had a guitar. This was Franz Gruber. He had a guitar, and his friend was with him, the poet, had written this poem, Silent Night, Stille Nacht, and he said, can you put this to music? And he did. And so that was what they had, with a guitar accompaniment and two voices singing. Shortly after that, one of the bands of roving musicians that existed in Europe at that time, especially in the Empire, the Austrian Empire, started to plug this song. It sounds somewhat like today, when music groups would travel around and perform different places. So they performed it, and it was an instant hit. Mm-hmm. Everywhere it caught on, and by 1 year later, it was all over Europe and spreading in the world. By 1839, they had gone over to the United States. One of them was still alive, I think Gruber, and had presented in New York, introduced Silent Night into New York. And the rest really is history, because even today, it's translated in I don't know how many languages.
Right.
And even people who are religious like Silent Night. So here was this thing where a bad weather, terrible weather on Christmas Eve, nobody could get in to celebrate the service. And they even had to have the service in a little chapel because you could not use a guitar. You were not allowed to use a guitar in church. And I think we had one more picture. I think the next picture, in fact, yes, this shows us the Franz Gruber's schoolroom. There it gives you a little feeling for the times, and off in the country there in the schoolhouse. And I believe we have one more picture from that, which is yes, that's the chapel. Some of these I had really trouble blowing up, but it's a very simple little chapel. It's been rebuilt and refurbished in years since, but that's, you know, where it was and what it was, and led to this Christmas, just this lovely song spreading around the world.
All because they couldn't have a regular service.
All because, and because the weather
kept,
this wintry weather froze them out of their proper celebration. Yeah, I think that's pretty important. Now we're going to go back in time from the year about 1600 up until a few years into the 1800s. And we're going to find ourselves on the bank of the Thames River in London.
Okay.
Now, it's an actual fact that the Thames has frozen at London a number of times, and many, many times in past history. But for 7 of those times, it froze so hard that they actually set up like a town on it. It was up to 3 feet, up to a yard thick.
Oh my goodness.
The ice was. So you could not only walk on it, but you could, let's see, football pitches, bowling matches, fruit sellers, shoemakers, barbers, pubs, and booths, all kinds of booths and tents. People had dances out there, took their pets out there, had dog and pony shows, and they even would build fires. The ice was so thick, no danger. They'd build a fire inside their tent or their pub. Yeah, that was one in 1607 and 1608. In fact, that's the first one that anybody wrote down. Later, in 1683, there was a very famous one, and that one, it was so cold that the ocean was frozen for up to 2 miles off southern England. Imagine that.
That
Salt
is cold.
water and everything frozen off there. There was a famous English diarist, and I never heard of him, frankly, but he was a famous one at the time. And his name was Yvonne, and what he wrote about was coaches plied from Westminster to the Temple. So if you wanted to go through London, you went to one of these places on the bank, you know, where you could access the river, now frozen, and you take a coach, and because there weren't any more water taxis, but enterprising folks would get horses and coaches down there. And from several other stairs, to and fro, just like in the streets, sliding with skeets, which is either a great tempo or somebody just skating on the river. Hans Brinker, I think of, and of course, Holland froze too. But sliding with skeets, bull baiting, they had a bull baiting fair.
My goodness.
Horse and coach races, puppet plays, interludes, restaurants, tippling, and other lewd places, so that it seemed a bacchanalian triumph or a carnival on the water. This all sounds very gay and mad and wild. The problem was that it lasted for some time, a couple of months anyway. And meanwhile, it was just as cold in people's homes.
Yes, yes.
So people were dying regularly of just of the cold. But you couldn't ship any food in, you couldn't ship any food out.
Yeah.
So food ran out. It was
probably coal supply for the fires, and
coal, lumps of coal couldn't come in. Right. But now it says on here it was a severe judgment. This terrible winter was a severe judgment on the land. The trees not only split open, struck by lightning, but people and cattle just perished overall, everywhere you look. And the very sea was so locked up with ice that no vessels could stir. So this began to have more than just a local effect, because of course the trade, there wasn't any trade. They couldn't trade on it. And when the thaws broke, they broke very suddenly. You didn't suddenly see a couple bubbles or something, or it would be a little, no, they'd go suddenly overnight. And whoever was in the way, whatever boat or person or whatever was in the way, just was washed away. So they weren't so nice. But they had one other one, there was one in 1739 where a whole batch of ice gave way at the same time, a whole, you know, like a whole village square or something, gave way at one time. Then in 1789 there was another one like that. And this story, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't read it in a little book I have, which is supposedly, you know, people who were there lived it. The captain of a ship lying offshore, in order to secure his ship's cables, you know, so he wouldn't be washed away or swept away, made an agreement with an innkeeper, somebody who had a bar and grill here apparently, to fasten a cable to his premises. Well, that sounds a little risky, but they brought a cable ashore. In consequence, a small anchor was carried ashore and placed in the cellar of this place.
Oh, in the cellar.
And just to make sure, they brought another cable and they put it around a beam in another part of the house.
I can imagine what's going to happen.
And you can imagine what's going to happen. They thought they'd have some warning, but they didn't, because it says here, during the night, the ship came about and the cable held fast, unfortunately, carried away the beam and leveled the house, by which accident 5 persons asleep in their beds were killed. Now, this is really serious, serious winter damage. And it happened, apparently, a total of 24 times between then and modern times, never quite that thick. But I saw a picture one place, was a drawing, you know, from the early days. It showed the chunks of ice. I don't know if they drew them, cut them apart in the picture, because obviously it was solid, but you could see it. It's way, way down. It was as though they on huge wooden blocks getting around. But that I really thought was pretty terrible.
Yeah.
Now part of that may have been, of the terrible cold that those years, may have been due to volcanic eruptions.
Oh, really?
In the South Seas.
Yeah.
Let's look at another couple of pictures before we leave for the frost fairs. This is later a painting, and you see there's London, the city, in the background. In the foreground, where all these little booths and tents are.
Oh, out on the ice.
This is, this is what it was like. And what that is over there on the right, I'm not quite sure, but it was some kind of a device, you know, for moving stuff, apparently. Going on to the next picture, we saw a contemporary sketch of what somebody made, I mean, not in that very year, but later. And you can see all the booths set up just like a city street.
Like a city street.
You know, or like a market or something. And there they were out there, all the stuff set up, and the city way in the background. Again, you could see how big it was, because the Thames is very, very wide there, and ever since very early days, they'd had some kind of bridge across it. The Vikings, for instance, were stymied at one point by that bridge. But the bridge, of course, made it all the worse, because they had piers very close together. And as the ice started to form, and how it did with the tide going up and down every day, I don't know, but it did. And the ice would pile up, and then the whole thing would just just freeze up. So, but that's what it looked like. And our next picture shows a map, and this I'm just showing you in this form because way off the right left, the right low corner there, you see Australia and then beneath it you can see a little fuzz beneath. Well, that's Indonesian islands down there. And where you cover that distance then with Europe, the little green patch up there, and with our country, our continent over there, you see what a big distance it was. Now, of course, this is a round thing, but something from that small an area where there was a great deal of volcanic activity in that period. And now we remember Krakatoa, hearing about that from 1883, and that created some cloudy weather and dark days at vast distances. And we had other big ones that had an effect. But this one, it said it was, I think, the second or third hugest explosion, volcanic explosion that they can trace on the Earth's surface. And it was so big that it shot mainly ash, but in the boulders too. Boulders didn't go quite as high, but it shot them up in the stratosphere instead of just the atmosphere.
Right.
And the stratosphere doesn't have clouds or anything, so it stayed there. And then the Earth,
Just
the normal
circled the Earth.
currents on the Earth, wind currents, just around it went. And by a few, it took a little bit of time, but consider the distance.
Yeah.
It was spread out all over, and all the world felt it. And the world temperature, they've traced that from taking ice cores from places like, Greenland and so on.
And found the ash.
They figured out the Earth's average temperature for the entire Earth went down about 1 degree, which is stupendous. Now that they're warning us so much and getting these small amounts, but the Earth's temperature did go down. Amongst the worst places to get it were Western Europe and our East Coast. And when it was taking full effect, for example, in Quebec, they had a foot of snow in June. Middle of June, they had a foot of snow. All the inlets, all the places that normally are not frozen, everything was frozen. And again, it wasn't just that temporary inconvenience, or that it bothered trade, but it killed off the creatures in the sea.
Sure.
It killed off any crops that existed, and of course prevented any more being grown. It was horrible, and extended far back into the continent, but somehow was worse in this place by the sea. Now the one Taliban was the one that went off in 1815, and by the end of that year, these fierce examples had occurred. Let's look at a picture here, please. And this represents a farmer kneeling down and looking at his crop that is, growing up
frozen,
and is now gone. So he's out of business. The next picture is a contemporary drawing, picture drawing. And again, you can see a couple there with anything they get to wrap around them, and they are towing behind them. They're whatever they saved of it, but everything is barren around there. The next picture will show us a picture of the fantastic sunsets occurred, and we saw something like it in the Philippines when Mount Pinatubo went off, and of course it was local, but we had much more colorful.
I remember when Mount St. Helens blew. We had a lot of ash from that in this area.
One. Yeah, there was a great big explosion. But you see the black cloud going up from it. Now that's ash, and the ash was spread several feet thick over places many miles away. Now this would, of course, impede sunlight from coming in.
We're coming down near the end.
Oh, well, give me just time to mention, there's another one that I remember reading about many years ago, and I cannot find it documented anywhere. I looked online and everything, and in books I have, and that was, involved the Black Plague, particularly in England, was also on the continent, but particularly in England, and that was about 1320. It ranged for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And the Black Plague allegedly got its start because an eruption, a big eruption, had more or less temporarily made winter all the time. This was almost another year without a summer that they had there. But I can't find that one documented anywhere. But I can remember it was just step by step. The thing erupts. Eventually, what it shoots off goes around. It blocks the sun.
Right.
The Earth starts having cooler weather. In some instances, very, very wintry weather. Everything falls off in the country. People get sick. A few people survive for DNA reasons, genetic reasons.
Right.
But if they haven't died off from the cold, and we forget people just die of the cold.
Right,
too.
right.
But these winter things.
And unfortunately, we still have that existing now in some cases.
Yes, we do. Mm-hmm. Yes, we do.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think of a few joyful moments, but of the effect, and most of the history things, you look up online, look up the Battle of the Spanish Succession, for instance, which was another one where the Europeans were all inter-allied. There's not a word in there about the effect the weather had, and it did have a big effect on that because France was so weakened.
Right.
But pretty interesting.
Okay.
So let's be glad for our Christmas this week, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have not that severe weather. So thank you, Jane. It's kind of an eye-opener because weather does affect us, not only our moods, but just what's available.
That's right.
Right.